out there. And that was loud. Anyway, welcome. I'm Kit Leggett and I serve on the Social Sciences Subcommittee for HASP. And one of my joys is to work with Dr. Fred Johnson on a number of the courses that he chooses to present to us, keep us all up to date in the world of history. We are going to be hearing the second in a series of topics today. And he entitled it, Cecil Rhodes Wasn't There When Europe's Chickens Came Home to Roost. Our main topic is Africa in the West. And one other little comment about the topic today, the Afro-European partnership binding the two continents was crushed and commerce between the two fell into disaster. So that's what we're going to be hearing about today. Let me just share a little bit more with you about the gentleman himself. He is from the state of Virginia. I think we can also say Commonwealth of Virginia. He is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. He has been teaching in the history department for Hope College for 21 years. He is a recipient of the HOPE, Hope Outstanding Teacher Award. And I'd like to add this. His hobby, we call jogging. He calls stagger jog, word dodging. And he does this with his dog, Professor Oppenheimer. What do you call him when you need him? Do you call him Prof or Oppie or Oppie? There we go. So I'm going to turn the morning over to Dr. Johnson, and he will continue talking to us about Africa and the West.
Good morning, scholars of HASP. It's good to be with you again, particularly. Thank you all for coming out on such a snowy morning. I'm always grateful when you all show up in inclement weather because it's just wonderful to see you. Picking up again on what Kit was talking about for our HASP winter 2022 session, this being part 3. This shows pretty much what I want to talk about this morning. This is on the far left, you see a picture of Cecil Rhodes, who was known as being the colonizer of the colonizers. Session 2, Cecil Rhodes wasn't there when Europe's chickens came home to roost. Where was there? We're talking about Africa, obviously, clearly, talking about Africa. And that map that I chose of Africa from the year 1880 shows the continent before while it was still pretty much in African hands. Oh, okay.
Okay, you should know how to do it from here.
Yes.
You're an old pro.
Okay. The map on the right shows Africa, so it shows a continent when it was still in the hands of Africans, either North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, the Sahel, et cetera, and so on. It's going to look radically different, actually 20 years just from that point where we're looking at it right now. But first things first. First things first. I want you to take a look at that, the northeastern part of the country, the continent rather. You see the nation of Sudan. There's Sudan, and then there's South Sudan. I mentioned to you all the different parts of the continent last week. The Horn of Africa, where Somalia is, in the far east. The Bight of Benin, the Gulf of Guinea, South Africa. Northwest Africa, where Morocco is, Algeria, Northern Africa, Libya. That area is primarily has a Muslim Arabic orientation, is oriented toward the Middle East. The first thing I wanted to mention this morning was that, as I mentioned to you all very briefly last week, in the 1950s and 1960s, right around the time when African independence nation, when the nations of Africa after World War II were starting to demand their independence, there arose a science or a field of study called Africology. This is where African scholars, politicians decided that they were going to take their own history, their own language, their own culture, and start talking about it from the African perspective. Because for decades, like a century or two, Europeans have been writing about Africa and Africans, telling the story from their perspective. And of course, usually when Europeans told that story, Africans ended up losing every time. They're cast as being barbarians, as being other than, as being odd, as being bizarre, anything but human. So Africans decided to reclaim the initiative, seize the initiative and tell their story, and tell the story from the perspective of their culture, their history, their language, their ways, their religions, everything. So that not so much for the world, but for themselves, because during the time of colonization and colonialism, the European story of Africa was told to Africans, which of course poisoned their own attitude about themselves. So they wanted to right that ship. So from first things first to next things now, we pick up from what we were talking about last week. The devil's bargain, the devil's handshake between Africa and Europe, which was that thing called the transatlantic slave trade. As we mentioned last week, the transatlantic slave trade, I think a lot of Americans are not aware of the fact that most of the people that were taken across the Atlantic Ocean, most of them went to South America, especially Brazil. Now, in North America, we generally have, when it comes to the history of slave rebellion, just to give you an example of how the disproportionality of this all is, you had 3 slave rebellions in America primarily. There's one in 1739 called the Stono Rebellion. It's 1739, which basically was just a flare-up that ended in maybe in about a day. Then in 1800, there was another one with Gabriel Prosper's Rebellion, which was actually just a conspiracy. It happened in Virginia, and it ended almost as fast as it started. In 1822, Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina, didn't really rebel. He was simply working with, amazingly enough, Black people and white people. All he wanted to do was take about 3,000 people and get out of the United States. He didn't want to tear up anything, kill anybody. They just wanted to say, you know what? We just want to leave to the Caribbean, to Nova Scotia, to Africa, anywhere but here. But they found it out, and of course, people were lynched and murdered and so on. And then, of course, the worst one in North America was 1830-31, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Southampton, Virginia. Compare those to the rebellion that started in Haiti in 1789, 1791, led by Toussaint Louverture. That rebellion lasted for years, and it eventually ended up kicking the French off the island and getting Haiti to become the first Black republic. In Brazil, in South America, and Jamaica, when they had slave rebellions down there, they lasted for years, months, weeks, years, and they involved thousands of people. I mean, these were outright rebellions, chaos, carnage. So when you take that, it gives you an idea of the number of slaves, African slaves in Brazil, South America, and the Caribbean compared to the small number that went to North America by proportion. So the summary of that, the summary of slavery in the Caribbean and Africa, elsewhere, and so on. Let me give you an example of just exactly what this was, because this confused my students, some of my students the other day. How many of you all have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave? Okay, so you remember the scene where Solomon Northup gets into the fight with the overseer, and then they try to hang him from a tree, and then somebody comes and the master comes, or the overseer stops to the hanging. Then he's just left there, hanging from the noose, and they stand on his tippy toes. Then after a while, other Black people start coming out of their cabins and whatnot, because they're scared. They come out of the cabins and they just start walking around like he's not even there. Now, some of my students, they figured out, why wouldn't they cut him down? Why would they just walk past him like he's not even there? They see him hanging from the tree. This is it. This is the summary. That system was so violent and so brutal and so inhumane, to cut him down would have meant that they too would have been hanging from a tree as well. So you literally had to learn to live with violence and brutality and inhumanity and find a way of emotionally ignoring it. Yes, the normal thing is to cut him down, to come to his rescue and give him some relief. But if you do that, then you're swinging from a tree. Human beings are not going to do that. Not regular, everyday, normal human beings. So that system is so violent and brutal and inhumane and frankly irrational, insane, where yes, you can walk by a body that's literally hanging from a tree, stand on their tippy toes at the edge of death and walk by and go pick your rose and continue on like nothing's happening. It is a scene from a bizarre hell that should never happen. And it happened in North America, specifically in the United States. So if you want a summary of what slavery was like, that was it. Your humanity was driven out of you. How? By a system that was founded in violence, maintained in violence, perpetuated by violence, and protected by violence. I usually put it to my students like this. If you want to understand how fast slavery wasn't leaving the United States of America, here's how fast it was not going anywhere at all. In the final analysis, after negotiations, after people praying or arguing that God was either for it or against it, in the final analysis, slavery in the United States ended by an act of war, the Civil War. There's nothing more violent that people have invented, that humanity has invented, than warfare. Whenever it happens, whether it was the Stone Age, whether it was World War I, Vietnam, or now, whenever war occurs, it's the most violent thing that we do to each other. So it took that instrument, warfare, an instrument of ultimate evil, to remove something just as evil. Evil vanquished evil. That's how fast it wasn't going away. The consequences of that. The consequences of slavery on the continent for North America were just as evil and problematic. By 1750, something was happening in Great Britain. Historians say between 1750 and 1760, something called the Industrial Revolution, we touched upon this last week, was already underway in Great Britain. I won't go into the details of the changes politically, economically, all the things socially that had to happen. Britain had to become a constitutional monarchy. The international financial system called mercantilism had to be established. Colonies had to be established. But the Industrial Revolution changed European politics, changed European economy, changed European needs, to where the Europeans, particularly the English, did not need slavery in their territories, in their colonies. They did not need slavery in England to the extent that it was. Their economy didn't need slavery, and they didn't need the transatlantic slave trade, because the Industrial Revolution says that things begin to shift from human beings and animals to machines. And if that's the case, you don't need people. That means slaves as well, although they continue using them in Jamaica and in British colonial possessions. Now, if you fast forward 50 years into the future, by 1800, of course, we've had the American Revolution from 1775 to 1781, the peace treaty in 1783 that finally ends the shooting phase of the American Revolution. By 1800, 50 years into England's Industrial Revolution, now a half century old, the British are now a half century less reliant upon the transatlantic slave trade, but the United States, ironically enough, has become more reliant upon it. By 1800, the United States of America, and particularly the state of Virginia, we tend to forget that by 1800, the state of Virginia was still a very big state. Imagine going from Richmond or from Norfolk on the actually coast of Virginia, far eastern Virginia, from there to Pittsburgh. That's a long drive today. That's how big Virginia was. We tend to forget that Virginia will not become a state with two parts of it, West Virginia and Virginia, until the summer of 1863, during the Civil War. So Virginia is a very big state in 1800. And also something's going on in Virginia called something that has a rare occurrence in modern history, where a slave population is literally reproducing itself. It takes talent to get people in bondage who are being abused to be so comfortable that they can still reproduce. So by 1800, there are enough slaves being reproduced in Virginia so that they can be literally exported domestically throughout the rest of the South. So as the British are becoming less reliant upon the transatlantic trade, America is getting a bumper crop of human beings. Back on the continent of Africa in 1804, massive change comes. In 1804, there is a Fulani cleric named Usman Dan Fodio. We also tend to forget that among the African people, there are many different ethnic groups. For goodness sake, I think there's more than 20 something in the nation of Kenya all by itself, the Kikuyu being the dominant largest ethnic group. Usman Dan Fodio was of the Fulani ethnic group. You have also the Hausa, the Yoruba, the Igbo, just some of the people who were in the area of Nigeria, which is where he would have been. Usman Dan Fodio was a cleric, a poet, a teacher. He was a follower of Muhammad. That means he practiced Islam. It was his belief that the Hausa rulers, Hausa spelled capital H-A-U-S-A, the Hausa rulers were not adhering to the tenets of Islam. He wanted to change that. So in 1804, he launched a jihad, which is not the kind of wild-eyed jihad that, the news media has been thrusting our way in the 21st century, not without some justification given the people that run these things. But his was more to try and sweep away corruption, infidelity. He was a purist. He wanted society he wanted people to be moral. He wanted parents to look after their children. When you think about it, it seems like, at least idealistically anyway, it seems like he was trying to do a very good thing. Was there warfare involved? Yes, because the Hausa rulers did not want a Fulani, who was a minority, to be telling them what to do. Think about the issue in the United States that we've been battling for years, minorities and majorities. That exists on the African continent as well. The Hausa majority resisted the Fulani minority. The Fulani minority did not like being a minority, so sometimes they push back. And this time, the Fulani minority has a leader who's got a larger following and is growing as well. What eventually happens is that Usman Dan Fodio establishes something called the Sokoto Caliphate. If you're wondering about things like today, like Boko Haram is a ISIS offshoot or an ISIS wannabe. People wonder, how did Islam get into West Africa? Why is there an ISIS offshoot called Boko Haram or an ISIS wannabe called Boko Haram? Islam, as I said to you all last week, is not new to Africa. Islam was in West Africa by the 8th or 9th century. So Islam as a tradition has been in West Africa for a long, long time. Frankly, it predates Christianity in West Africa. There are two competing religions. And as I mentioned to you last week, because Islam is one of the 3 religions of the book, in order to be a good practicing Muslim, you have to be able to read and write. The Quran was written in Arabic. So in addition to their indigenous languages, people had to also be able to speak and read and write Arabic, which means that they were multilingual, minimally. They were dealing with the French and the English. That means they were speaking at a minimum 3 languages. A lot of these people who were middlemen spoke a minimum of 4 languages, not to mention the dialects. These are extremely, extremely linguistic people, talented, educated, and in many cases, brilliant. The Sokoto Caliphate, if you look at a map on the left, today, the Sokoto Caliphate would span across the nations of Mali, Burkina Faso, which right now is going through some terrible, terrible times because of a military coup, Ghana, Benin, Togo. Now, to put this in context, Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast, and it was a British colony. Togo and Benin, they were French colonies. They speak French today. Nigeria, which is where, if you look at where it says Sokoto Caliphate, that is spanning across the nation of Nigeria. So you see it's going through, and you see Ibadan to the south, Lagos to the south. Lagos, I think, is the capital of Nigeria. Ibadan, which was a major Islamic teaching center. And then it spans across also into Cameroon. Now you'll notice that it's in northern Cameroon. I must digress, or not digress too much, but tell you all that in northern Cameroon, to this day, the last time I saw them was in 2006-07, so it's been a while. But I was in northern Cameroon. I had the fortune to go to northern Cameroon, right around the Nigerian-Cameroonian border. in the early 2000s. And there's a group of people up there called the Fons, F-O-N-S. If you remember what was that show that came on in the 80s? Happy Days, remember that? Remember Henry Winkler was playing the Fonz? So that's how they say it. It's the Fons, they're called Fons. These are traditional rulers who sometimes can date their lineage back 300, 400, 500 years. It was amazing to see them. And here's the thing, in Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon, they put out policies and rules and whatnot. When you go into the highlands of Cameroon, the government doesn't tell those guys what to do. They're the boss up there. If you come from Yaoundé to northern Cameroon to tell those Fons what to do, you are likely to be sent home without your head, which is a difficult way to travel. Because the Fons are traditional rulers, they are polygamous. The one king that I met, he had I don't know, over 10 wives and about 300 children. Now, they're absolutely in charge. They're elegant, they're rulers, and they are powerful. You should see people, they treat them like super aristocracy. And it is like stepping back into the 18th, 17th century to see them. Truly was amazing. The Sokoto Caliphate, if you look at where it is right there, spanning across Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, compared to modern day Africa, you can see that the Sokoto Caliphate that was established by Ousmane Dan Fodio covered a lot of territory by modern day standards. Bear with me as I read. The Sokoto Caliphate from 1806 to 1906 was the largest state in West Africa since the 16th century, created by Muslim reformers because there was Ousmane Dan Fodio, but then of course there were people that followed him with similar motives. They wanted to purify Islam. Created by Muslim reformers in the Hausa states, they believed local rulers weren't true to believers of Islam. It consisted of conquered Hausa states, that is, the Sokoto Caliphate consisted of conquered Hausa states and neighboring territories. Ousmane Dan Fodio's jihad began a series of other related jihads in other parts of the Savannah and Sahel beyond Nigeria's border. Now, the Sahel is that part of Northern Africa that we might call, if you had a geographic comparison to the African Sahel, it will be called the Great Plains, the grassy areas of the United States. So not wooded, not forested, not jungle, but more like grassy plains. Still not sub-Saharan Africa, also known as Black Africa, to be inarticulate about it, but a very, very, very vast portion of the continent. The result was you end up with Islam in Senegal, in modern day Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire, as it is known today, Chad, Central African Republic, and Sudan. The legacy of it. In Sudan today, there are differences that sometimes result in violence between the Arabic Muslim North and the Black Christian South. To put it simply, it is much more complex than that, but just for our digestion here this morning. In Chad, you have conflicts also cut along religious lines between Muslim and Christian. In Central African Republic, in recent years, there have been violence between where you have the Christians who have been waging war on and committing atrocities and genocide against the Muslims. In Cote d'Ivoire, I don't exactly know what the situation is in Cote d'Ivoire, but I do know that right now there is a Muslim insurgency in Mali, and there's destabilization in Mauritania. So the legacy of Islam and whatever it means in modern day, how people have taken Islam and perverted the words of the Quran and the vision of Muhammad. People are doing it today more for political reasons than Ousmane Dan Fodio was doing it, trying to make a better society. In 1807, now we're talking about 57 years into the British Industrial Revolution. 57 years old now. In 1807, the British unilaterally, all by their lonesome, declared that the transatlantic slave trade was illegitimate. In other words, it's illegal trade. Why? Well, first off, there had been a big anti-slavery movement in England led by William Wilberforce. Those of you who saw Amazing Grace the movie, recall that. And so William Wilberforce, Grenville Sharp, and Thomas Clarkson, three of the primary leaders of the abolition movement in Great Britain. There was also a gentleman named Olaudah Equiano, who had been captured in the interior of Africa, dragged in a coffle to the coast, and been sold to different people here and there. By 1789, Olaudah Equiano wrote his narrative, and he eventually earned enough money to buy his own freedom, and he became part of a group called the Sons of Africa, which was based in England, and they also were very powerful opponents and outspoken about the transatlantic slave trade. But in any case, in 1807, England just said, this trade is illegal. So they did a great moral thing, but economically, the British didn't need anymore. And to further strengthen their position economically on an international scale, if France and any other nation needed slaves, they were going to put the kibosh on that, and they did. So all of a sudden, something they had been doing for quite a long time was illegitimate. But that produced a conundrum. That produced a difficult situation, or if not a difficult situation, at least a moment of confusion for a place called the United States of America. Because in America, according to our US Constitution, the one drafted in 1787, before the ink dried on that document, before it could be ratified, at the convention in Philadelphia, in order to make sure that the convention did not collapse. And this is one thing that I really had to stress to my US history students, because they wonder sometimes, why didn't they just get rid of slavery when they had a chance? When they went to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, that was not their mandate. They went there to found a government. In other words, their number one went, if you had to ask them, what's your mission? Is it to get rid of slavery? No, it's not. Our mission is to take a look at the Articles of Confederation, see where they're weak and where we can revise them, and where they can be revised to make their revision, to make this government strong. They looked at the document and saw that it was completely deficient overall. So then they decided to go ahead and draft a brand new one, and they produced something called the Constitution. While they were in deliberations, from the spring through the summer of 1787, the convention almost collapsed several times over the issue of slavery, because there were Southern delegates there who were slave owners at the convention who were absolutely not going to give up their human property. So they made several compromises, pro-slavery compromises. Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 was what they call the 3/5 compromise, which helped shake out the disputes about representation in the Congress and also taxation. Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3 was the fugitive slave clause, which essentially said, even if you run away from the South to a place in the North where there's no slavery, you still can be recaptured upon claim of anybody claiming you, anyone. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Anyone could claim you and drag you back to bondage. And then there was Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1 said, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. I need to go slow on this, because sometimes, when you read the language of the Constitution, it just go right past you. These men, we need to remember who these people were. First of all, they had guts. They were brilliant. They were courageous. They had fought the British. They had taken on the world's greatest power and succeeded. At a minimum, they deserve credit for that, because if they had lost that contest, the British were going to surely execute them. So they had everything on the line, and they succeeded. They bested the British. So we know they're courageous. We know they're experienced, because you don't take on the British and win by being stupid. So they're pretty sophisticated. They're literate, they're educated, and many of them are wealthy. They're so brilliant, they're so educated, they're so experienced, they're so worldly, that they know that if they put the word slavery into a document that starts off with language that says, we the people of the United States, they know that if they put the word slavery into that document, that down through the ages of history, they will be considered, at a minimum, they'll be called hypocrites. At worst, who knows? So they're worldly enough, smart enough, brilliant enough, courageous enough to know they can't let that word in there. So in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3, they use language, euphemistic language, and phrases like such persons. So is the case with Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1. The migration or importation of such persons. As any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. We also don't want to overlook the language that they're using right here. Again, very learned people, very sophisticated, and already looking at their own country. This is 1787. We also need to remember that in 1787, the Confederation Congress, that Congress that still was under the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution was adopted, ratified and adopted in 1789, the Confederation Congress had passed something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 essentially carved out territory and set the rules for what a territory had to do to ask admission to join the Union of States, meaning the United States. Those future states included Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So even by 1787, they were already looking at the movement of American citizens going from east to west and knowing that this thing is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So therefore, they say the migration or importation of such persons as any of these states now existing, meaning we have some that exist and there are some that are probably going to join. As any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, the migration or importation of such persons shall not be prohibited. Congress, before you've even formed, Congress, before you fill your first session, you shall not do the following thing. You shall not prohibit those such persons. You shall not prohibit their migration or importation. We understand migration. What's importation? In the 21st century, when you import people, they call that human trafficking. So you shall not stop the human trafficking of such persons prior to the year 1808. Why 1808? I'm glad you asked. In 1787, slavery was already a problem. Black folks won't work, they run away, they break stuff, they sabotage what they're doing. Why can't they just be good, happy slaves and do what they're told to do? It was already a problem. It was already a millstone around the nation's neck. They simply didn't know what to do about it though. Southerners weren't going to give it up. So they decided to give themselves a 20-year window. Somehow 20 years into the future, we'll figure out what to do about this. Maybe it'll finally collapse on its own weight. Maybe it'll go away. Maybe we'll figure out a way to compromise and get rid of it. But 20 years seemed like a safe bet. Well, now 20 years had come, and the year before, the British had said it's illegitimate trade. Well, what about you, America? What about that? Well, by 1808, things had changed in America. But this also goes on to say, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importations not exceeding $10 for each person. I don't know how you all read this, but it sounds to me like the US government, by virtue of the Constitution, was involved in the transatlantic slave trade to the tune of $10 per person. Since generally speaking, government doesn't produce much, now saying they're going to get $10 for each of these such persons. Here's what happened. Why couldn't they get rid of it? Because 43 years into the Industrial Revolution, let me recap for a moment. If the Industrial Revolution in England starts in 1750, that revolution of industry is driven by one sector of the British economy, textiles. Textiles that need a raw material called cotton. Do you see where I'm going? In America, cotton was already being produced, but it was labor intensive and very, very, very cumbersome and inefficient. In 1793, a certain inventor named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which suddenly gave American cotton producers, that is slave owners who are growing slave-produced cotton, a way of producing more cotton and getting it to the British right at the moment when the Industrial Revolution was gathering momentum and hit a critical mass when they couldn't get enough of that raw material. Suddenly, American slave owners growing cotton produced by slaves had a raw material and a customer who couldn't get enough of their product. They had the wonderful problem of a customer that needed what they had yesterday. They couldn't help but get rich. And because the cotton became so valuable, the people who produced the cotton became valuable. Do you understand? So therefore, there was the cotton and the slave trade in America, that is the people that produced it the trade in the human beings ramped up as well. 1808 came and went, and into the future America went. So now what? What do we do? Well, the Constitution said is getting rid of it in 1808. Well, we know that people, they were not going to give. I read material that says that by the time the Civil War came in 1860-61, human property, human capital in America, slave property amounted to about $10 billion. $10 billion worth of slaves in the 19th century. No human being that I know of is going to walk away from that kind of money. They're not going to do it. So constitutional provision notwithstanding, whatever, man, they continue. Now, what happens in England, 25 years into the future past 1808, the British, let me specify, the British in 1807, they outlawed the transatlantic trade, but they did not outlaw the system of slavery. In 1833, they passed another law called the Abolition of Slavery Act, which now they've outlawed the trade in slaves, but they've also outlawed the practice of slavery inside of the British Empire. By 1850, the relationship between England and Europe was changing. This also is the beginning of this is also the decade when the two-party system in America begins to collapse. This is the year when California would join the Union as a free state. This is the decade where you're going to have, in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's going to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1854, Stephen Arnold Douglas, who wants to be president, is going to introduce the Kansas-Nebraska Act. 1856, Charles Sumner is going to get beat nearly to death on the floor of the Senate by Preston Brooks. In 1858, 1857, the slave Dred Scott is going to be told by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney that there's no law concerning a black man that a white man is bound to respect. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln is going to stand up in the State House and say, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. In 1859, John Brown is going to make a raid on Harper's Ferry that's going to fail, not just fail, but fail miserably. And what all that's going on during the 1850s, in 1850s, England and Europe go into the Industrial Revolution 2.0. Second phase. By 1850, the English Industrial Revolution has migrated across the English Channel to places like Prussia, France, Austria. In Austria, you have an Austro-Hungarian Empire now. Prussia is going to eventually end up being Germany in 1860. So it is a second boost. And because it's a second boost or a different technology, the Industrial Revolution has produced some side effects. And now it's expanded. Consumerism is becoming more and more of a reality in Europe and around the world. And the Europeans need more raw materials, particularly from Africa. There's a particular kind of oil in West Africa called palm oil, which is very pure. It's better than any kind of oil that's been produced in America. It is just very, very, very good oil. And it was in high demand for industrialization. This continent, as you can see, if you take a look at it, you see in the center there, it says the Belgian Congo, Anglo-Egyptian. Things are going to change in Africa. This map right here shows the spread of the Industrial Revolution. You can see the blue arrow starts from England. It goes across the channel to the Netherlands, to Luxembourg, Belgium, then into France, then into Germany, then into Silesia, into Eastern Europe. Now Russia, Eastern Europe, and Russia will be the last to feel this wave of industrialization. And Russia is going to be very far behind, which is one of several reasons why when Russia finally does start to industrialize in the early 20th century, it's going to be such a painful affair. It's going to become catastrophic when Joseph Stalin just says, we need to become an industrial power and we want to do it now. So while the Americans are arguing about slavery and preparing for a civil war, in 1859, the English explorer Charles Darwin published his book called The Origin of the Species, where I won't get into all the details. You all are very well read and well informed group, so you know who Darwin was and what he did. But Darwin essentially said, after all of his studies, particularly the studies that he undertook while in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, Charles Darwin said, it appears, for example, that there are some species of animal that have been separated for a long time. Somehow or another, nature has given these animals certain qualities. And he doesn't know how nature selects them, but we do know that nature chooses winners and losers depending upon different changes, climatologically, geographically, whatever the reason. Nature selects different animals who will adapt, and then select some who will not adapt. Those who adapt will survive. Those who don't will fail. They become extinct. Dinosaurs once were the masters of the earth. Climate conditions changed. They didn't adapt. Smaller, hairy ones who were not nearly as strong as they were, they'll live that. So Darwin comes up with something called natural selection. I want to be very specific. He's confining what he said to nature. Now, many people call Darwin an atheist. He was not. He did not take God out of the equation. He was simply providing a scientific explanation. If this is what God has done, how can I explain this in scientific terms? This is the way, so if you prefer, the creator has done this, created these things, and they have survived in the following fashion. Winthrop Jordan, this is the guy that I told you all about last week. I could not remember the name of the author. Winthrop Jordan, speaking of survival and natural selection and so on, Winthrop Jordan said in his book, White Over Black, American Attitudes Toward the Negro, a study that he conducted that spanned the years 1550 to 1812. So he's talking about 1550, that would have been the years of exploration when Europeans first come in contact with West Africa. And I remember just dropping my jaw when the first time I read this book. He said that one of the worst things that ever happened was the European sailors who were superstitious and very, very, believed in mysticism and so forth. They landed in West Africa and saw a species of ape that looked a lot like the chimpanzees that were also in West Africa, because they immediately associated one with the other and called them ape men. That stereotype, that image persists down to present day. Most people in the 21st century will know that that is baloney, but there are some, for their own ideological preferences, will continue to conflate that. In 1861, April 12, 1861, the US Civil War will begin when Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor, 2 years after Darwin's Origin of the Species. The Civil War ends on April 9th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated 5 days later on April 14th. But now that America has gone through this great conflagration, this great paroxysm on what to do about, the 4-year fight, essentially, over slavery, now America begins the process of reconstruction that lasts from 1865 to 1877. During that period, during that 12-year period of 1865 to 1877, Charles Darwin's ideas on natural selection are lifted by a guy named Herbert Spencer, another English philosopher, who's got a completely different orientation than Charles Darwin did. Herbert Spencer says, what Darwin said about animals in nature, some are naturally selected to dominate, to survive. Some are naturally unfit to survive, so therefore they become extinct. Herbert Spencer says, does it not also apply to humanity? Some people are naturally selected to dominate. Others are naturally cut out to be dominated. In other words, there are some species, some people on Earth who are designed specifically to rule over others, and some who are specifically designed to be ruled by others. In other words, he said, those who rule survive. Those who can't, those who rule are fit. Those who are not fit to rule are not fit. It's survival of the fittest. This process, this belief of survival of the fittest, particularly when it comes to human beings, begins to gather momentum as a belief. Right around the same time, you find something happening which produces dangerous consequences for the African continent, right around the year 1879. I need to emphasize that by the time you get to 1879, forces that have been that have been gathering all along. Differences, changes in people's attitude and the economy, the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, all these things, one year after another, have all been gathering steam, have been adding their element to the international stew, which produces something in 1879 called the Scramble for Africa. That map on the left is Africa in the year 1880. In other words, obviously 1 year after 1879. And European historians, African historians, historians of imperialism during this period, colonialism, they call this a scramble for a very good reason, because it literally was a scramble for Africa. What this map does not show you is that by 1879, Europeans were already in Africa in large numbers. They were already in Africa, and they were already competing for territory on the African continent. One of the side effects, one of the consequences of depopulating your continent for 300 years, selling off your strongest, youngest, best, and brightest, is that when you need them to be around to defend you, guess what? They're not there. And since you have been selling off during that 3-year period, mostly young men who are needed in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean or North America or the mines of Brazil, what you've done in that 3-century period, you've ended up with more women than men. You're forced to change in marriage patterns, where one time people were monogamous, now they're polygamous. Let me give you a more up-to-date example. The last time Dr. Vanderstoep and I took students to Vietnam, we went to the Vietnamese-Chinese border. And in the northern part of Vietnam, this is several hours north of Hanoi. We were told by one of the Hmong women that the Chinese, every now and then, they come across the border into Vietnam and they kidnap women. Why is this? Well, because you know that for about 3 decades, China had a one-child policy, and they favored boys over girls. So now they have an abundance of women who can't find husbands, or rather, you have an abundance of men who can't find wives. So they're literally kidnapping Hmong women, so these men can have somebody to marry. That's what happens with depopulation. Just one example. The scramble for Africa becomes this frenzied, fanatical grab for land. Europeans start falling over each other. French claim this territory. The British claim that territory. The Germans want this territory. The Portuguese are involved. The Danes are involved. You have people in South Africa. The Dutch are involved. And colonialism, I said to you all the last time, that colonialism was just another form of slavery, and that's exactly what it was. If you ask anybody during the Mau Mau Rebellion, or the rebellion was called the Burning Spear in Kenya during the 1950s, led by Jomo Kenyatta, they will tell you, ask any indigenous Kenyan how the British were as colonizers. They were awful. Now, colonialism, imperialism was bad on its best day. But there were some who were just completely awful about it. This is a pretty famous picture or drawing of what it was like to be a colonizer in the British form. And this business of showing these guys kissing their feet, let's put it like this, that's not the worst part of it. But it does show how Europeans look down upon Africans, and the Africans noticed this. They saw it. They knew what was going on. I mean, people knowing they're being dehumanized, just because they don't have the power or the strength to fight back or do something about it, doesn't mean they don't know. They knew. This one right here in the rubber coils, this is particularly, this is a cartoon that's taking a jab at King Leopold II of Belgium. This one right here, this advertisement always has intrigued me. Let me read the caption. It says, "The first step towards lightening, the white man's burden," because Rudyard Kipling in 1901 wrote this poem called The White Man's Burden. I'll share it with you next time. But it says the white man's burden, the first step toward lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, because clearly Africans don't know anything about being clean. How do you do that? By using Pear soap. It is a potent factor. Pear soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. Remember I shared with you all the last time that Henry Morton Stanley's book was called what? The Dark Continent, to convey mystery, danger, You know, lack of civilization, savagery, barbarism is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth. As civilization advances, if civilization is going to advance into this room right now, the only way civilization can advance into this room is if there's no civilization in here. So when you land on somebody's continent saying, I'm bringing you literacy and civilization and decency, I've already assumed the conclusion that you don't have that already, or whatever brand you have it is, not good enough. While amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. Okay, good for you, Pear Soap. See if this will work.
England, August 1882, at the end of the Zulu Wars. At a country residence of Her Imperial Majesty Queen Victoria, amidst an unprecedented blaze of publicity and public interest in the Zulu people of Southern Africa, an historic meeting took place between the Queen, the political and military advisors, and the defeated and exiled King of the Zulus. He came
Okay, well, the mic is turned all the way up, and this is from the film, this is from the miniseries Shaka Zulu, which came out in 1986. I will send to Kim the link for this, and you all can watch the very beginning of it. What it shows is Cetshwayo, who was a descendant of Shaka, the great Zulu king, the Zulu warrior who formed the Zulu people, who were basically cattle herders into a mighty army. It shows at the very beginning how Cetshwayo goes to England to appeal to Queen Victoria to let join a partnership with the Zulu people. Now, Cetshwayo goes there as the king of a nation. And the Queen's advisors around here are referring to him in his presence, calling him a savage, saying that saying things like a return to the plow might bring some civilization to these savages. So the man is sitting there, and then finally one of the guys says, he bends down to Cetshwayo and says, shall I translate, my lord? And the king says, there's no need. We have such different, besides what good would it do? We have such differing opinions on what it means to be decent and humane to each other. This is the Zulu king talking to the queen and her ministers. She eventually tells him, no, I'm not going to become ally my state with yours because the spirit of Shaka still looms over you very much. As Europe expands into Africa, enter Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was identified as being the colonizer, a colonizer's colonizer. Let me tell you how important Cecil Rhodes was. Cecil Rhodes, you ever heard of something called the Rhodes Scholarship? That's named after him. Cecil Rhodes was so important as a colonizer, he ended up owning a controlling interest in something called De Beers Diamond Company. Ever heard of that? De Beers Diamond. So he's very wealthy. He was shrewd. He was born in England. He had relatives in South Africa. He was a sickly child, so they sent him to Africa because maybe the weather would do him right, and it did do him right. He ended up being very enterprising, very, very, very entrepreneurial. He got wealthy. Cecil Rhodes ended up becoming such a great colonizer. Take a look at that map down there toward the bottom. He literally had two nations named after him, Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia. Now, again, you all are a very savvy group, so I know you remember the days when there was a nation called Rhodesia, led by Ian Smith, white minority government, just like South Africa was. In fact, it was right next to South Africa. Rhodesia today is currently called Zimbabwe. And during the day, so Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, this guy was critical to the development of South Africa and also critical to the development of apartheid in South Africa. That is state-sanctioned segregation, racism, that depending upon what day and what year you look at it, made American racism, bad as it was, seem kind of like an amateur sport by comparison. But then something happened in Europe. Trying to draw a distinction here, and I don't want to make the mistake of telling Africa's story through European or even American eyes. But the two continents and then this continent, our nation, are deeply entwined with Africa. So deeply entwined, that's why it catches, when something that happens like Boko Haram on the African continent catches people by surprise because they don't realize how deep our roots go back with each other. Now, in 1861, the Northern Confederation of Germany united with the southern part to create the modern state of Germany in 1861 under Wilhelm I, the First Reich. The Second Reich would have been under Wilhelm II. The chief architect behind the first one, at least, was Otto von Bismarck, who brought Prussia and Southern Germany together to create the German state. And Germany got into the colonizing game along with every other European nation. Otto von Bismarck, seeing what was going on, Otto von Bismarck was very Machiavellian. He practiced something, they called him the Iron Chancellor, which should give you an idea of just what kind of a character he was. He's the Iron Chancellor. He's of the Prussian Junker tradition. He's an aristocrat. He's a politician. He's Machiavellian. He practices something called real politics, the politics of reality. From Otto von Bismarck's point of view, if he can get what he wants by going to war, he'll do that. If he can get what he wants by going to peace, he'll do that. If he can get what he wants by doing a combination of war and peace, he'll do that. Whatever works, it's a means to the end. But anything is on the table if it'll get him what he wants. In 1884, 1885, he notices, like other European powers, that the scramble for land in Africa is producing some unintended consequences on the European continent. Now, keep in mind what situation we're talking about. Africans are referred to as savages and barbarians and beasts, et cetera, and so on a regular basis. And there's no way that gentlemen in Europe, civilized Europeans, should be going to war over land populated by barbarians and savages. That's not what civilized people do. So Otto von Bismarck comes up with a plan. How about all of us who have territorial claims on the African continent, why don't we meet in Berlin? Why is Berlin important? Well, it's in Germany. And just as will be the case in 1904 and 1905, when Teddy Roosevelt is asked to mediate the Russo-Japanese War, being asked to do that, signals to the world that America is a young, rising power of future significance. Likewise, by all these other people coming to Berlin, signals that Germany is a young, rising power of future significance. So they go to Berlin to sit down, and it almost ties the tongue to say this. These individuals, but again, it helps to emphasize the mindset, the perspective, the outlook, the ethos that dominated in the 19th century. Imagine somebody saying this today. I'm going to invite you, a bunch of countries, to come to Washington, D.C. to sit down and figure out how we can carve up Central America for each other. That's essentially what they did. They came there to Berlin and sat down to dispute, to sit down and talk about how can we sit up and carve this continent up between ourselves like gentlemen. Now, a lot of sources will tell you that the United States did not have a representative there. That's wrong. We had one representative there. His name was John A. Kasson, Kasson, from Iowa. We weren't there to lay any physical claim to the continent. We were there to claim a seat at the table. If there's gonna be any trade done in Africa, American merchants, not surprisingly, they want to cut. So from November 1884 through February 1885, these guys sit down and without smiling and with total sincerity, sit down and carve up the African continent. Not a single African nation is invited to the conference, not one. Long deliberations, they figure out, for example, if person A makes a claim over here, it was called French Cameroon, then the French have to be able to support that. You got to have a certain number of people there. In other words, they figure out all the protocols for a claim to be legitimate. And if a claim is not legitimate, then they got to figure out what do they do about a dispute. Because what is happening The reason why this conference is called is because the territorial disputes between Europeans about the continent of Africa are spilling over and causing hostilities inside of Europe. It's causing difficulties for European nations in Europe, not in Africa. They're fighting in Europe, or they may fight in Europe about claims in Africa. And again, why would civilized people fight over a bunch of savages? That's not what they're going to do. That's not what they should do. So they finally figure it out. They get through it all. This political cartoon sums it up so well. This Otto von Bismarck with the knife cutting up the continent. Now I would not have you think that Africans just kind of took this line down. Africans fought back in several ways. They fought back well through armed resistance, as in the case, for example, of Samori Touré. Samori Touré. How many of you all remember the name Stokely Carmichael? Right? He was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, part of the Civil Rights Movement, used to work with SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Well, these names had, Stokely Carmichael, when he finally left the Civil Rights Movement, he moved to Ghana, and he took for himself the name Kwame Touré. Kwame, after the name Kwame Nkrumah, the first leader of Ghana, independent Ghana in 1957, and Touré, after this guy, Samori Touré, who waged a multi-year struggle against the French in West Africa. And here's how brilliant this guy was. Samori Touré knew that the French were going to outfight him. They had better technology than he did because they had weapons, they had guns, and they had good guns, good rifles. So he captured some French rifles and told his people to basically, we call it today, reverse engineer them. They broke them down, figured out how they work, then produced them themselves. He had tactics, he used guerrilla tactics, he formed alliances. In 1880, that's what Africa looked like. Samori Touré, this is while the French were taking over. So while the colonizer is colonizing, he established his own empire, while the colonizer is establishing an empire as well. So you have two competing forces here, one from the outside, one from the inside. So his empire spans across a good swath of West Africa, and is one of the reasons why those areas are able to remain independent for a long, long time. So he does fight back. There are other ways Africans fight back. Some just read the handwriting on the wall and say, you know what? We're not going to outlast you guys, so let's just make the best deal we can. Others do it. Others, like Otto von Bismarck, they use a combination of war and diplomacy. Some African rulers, they pit the British against the French. In other words, they play both ends against the middle. By 1914, this is what Africa looks like. Let's take another look. 1880. 34 years later, in other words, barely one lifetime later, the continent looks like this. Look at that area called French West Africa. It goes from Algeria and Morocco all the way down to Senegal and around Liberia. You notice in the east, in the Horn of Africa, the Empire of Ethiopia, the Ethiopians are one of two African nations that do not get colonized by the Europeans. The Italians try to do it, but in 1886, the Ethiopians defeat the Italian colonizer at a place called Adowa, A-D-O-W-A. At the Battle of Adowa, the Italians are soundly defeated. They become the laughing stock of Europe because a bunch of Africans, how dare you let a bunch of Africans, a bunch of spear throwers, defeat a modern nation? Now, in 1935, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, the Italians will return and they will wage savage war on the Ethiopians in vengeance, in revenge for that humiliating defeat. So it's almost appropriate that Mussolini, the fascist, led that activity. The other nation that's left alone on the African continent is Liberia in the West. Liberia is an American outpost. It doesn't want to be. America doesn't want it to be an outpost, but it is. Liberia is that place where former free blacks from the United States or former slaves were sent there for, among other reasons, to Christianize the heathen. or to just get them out of the country. Either way, Liberia is that place where they have a red, white, and blue flag, a capital named Monrovia after James Monroe. It is an American representation. So out of deference to the United States, not out of fear, I need to make sure I get that point across, not out of fear, but out of deference to the United States, the Europeans leave Liberia alone. But every other part of the continent is conquered. In 15 years, from 1885 to 1900, listen, it's an ugly kind of event, but it's amazing because of the sheer magnitude. When you realize how big the African continent is, the fact that the Europeans can conquer this thing in 15 years is just stunning. It is amazing for all the wrong reasons. But that conquest produced some side effects. And this is where Europe's chickens came home to roost. It had the continent, but by 1914, Europe had changed as well. By 1914, suspicions in Europe, the usual human foibles of diplomacy and so on, and militarism, that is, increasing sizes of militaries. The only nation in Europe that frankly saw its military shrink during this period was the Ottoman Empire, or the Ottoman Turks, right around modern day Turkey. But in Austria-Hungary, especially in Germany, in France, in England, even in Russia, their armies grew larger and larger and larger. Think of militarism as an arms race. And we know what has happened too often when leaders get big armies and big weapons. There's always a temptation and a desire to want to use them. So the situation in Europe was becoming more and more dire. And with the start of the 20th century, diplomacy did not become easier. In fact, warfare broke out in the Balkans in the early 1900s, like in 1906, 1907, then again in 1912, 1913. And the difficulties in the Balkans area, and if you look at Austria-Hungary, do not mistake that as being some type of happy empire. The Austro-Hungarians had something they call their Balkan problem. Because in Austria-Hungary, next to Eastern Europe, near Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and so on, they had the same issues that in some way, in some cases, they're not the same, clearly, they're not the same, but they mirror, they echo the difficulties back then. You have a bunch of different nationalities who all want to be independent. You have different forms of Islam in Eastern Europe. Sunni, Sufi, Shiite. You have different forms of Christianity. There's Catholicism in that area, and then there's Catholicism, then different forms of Protestant Christianity, different ethnicities, different languages. They couldn't get along. So the Austro-Hungarians for years have been looking for a reason to crush all those ethnic identities and get rid of their Balkan problems. Those problems were further exacerbated because even though Europeans had conquered the African continent, there were still territorial disputes that flared up into warfare sometime that spilled over back into difficulties for an already dicey situation in Europe. And as you get closer and closer to 1914, a crisis will build. A crisis will build of such amazing proportions that all it will take is the assassination of one low-level official or mid-level official named Franz Ferdinand, who's the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His uncle is named Franz Joseph. And the assassination of one man, as tragic as assassinating anybody is, one man's assassination will cause a movement of reaction in Europe that will eventually produce World War I in 1914. Part of that conflict involved disputes over the African continent. During that conflict, as Europe's chickens come home to roost, there will be colonial soldiers from British Ghana, British East Africa, meaning Kenya, and Tanzania, or as they called it, Tanganyika, which is also ruled by the Germans. There'll be French troops Black African troops from French West Africa, who will be brought to Europe to see the world's first industrial war. The United States is identified as being the first nation on earth that introduced humanity to modern war. Modern war meaning that it's not good enough for me to destroy you on the battlefield. I got to destroy your farms, your rivers. In other words, the things that help you make war in the first place. That means literally making war on civilians. Now, civilians have always been collateral damage if you don't put it like that, but now it's with intent. World War I takes that mindset, takes that value system, and then industrializes it. It makes it massive. And when African troops come to Europe and see that carnage and that destruction being done by the people who've been calling them savages and barbarians, they're saying they're uncivilized, and then they see it twice in World War II, they take those images and those lessons and the memory of how they've been treated back to Africa with them, and it sets up a dynamic for the late 1940s, early 1950s, when they realize that France and England no longer have the muscle to keep them under their colonial heel, and they begin to demand independence. And they do it like this. They say, look, you can either grant us independence or we can take it from you. Your choice. And because it's going to be the Cold War, and there'll be two new major powers who are now dictating international affairs. One's called the Soviet Union. The other one is called the United States. It's got nuclear power. And now it's going to be up to them. What happens to Africa under their watch? When African leaders from World War I and World War II come to the United States and say, will you help us get rid of our French colonizer? Just very similar to what happened in the case of Vietnam, when the Vietnamese came to America and said, will you help us get rid of the French colonizer? Europe is going to be very important to us. Given a choice of helping Africans or Vietnamese civilians, Europe is too important because the Russians are there, and it's more important to protect Berlin than it is to free Lagos, Nigeria. So decisions will be made in Washington then that we continue to live with today. So coming next week, the Storm of the 21st Century. I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for another very interesting presentation, Dr. Johnson. Are there questions from the floor this morning?
I will interpret that to mean that you're all mesmerized.
There are no questions in the chat.
I'm interested in the slave trade to Brazil and what ended up with the politics there with regard to slavery compared to the United States.
The question is, what happened with what happened with regard to the slavery in Brazil, particularly as it pertains to politics? There's a large Afro-Brazilian population in Brazil, Gary, a large Afro-Brazilian population. And they live in, just like a lot of people in what's called the African diaspora. There's a thing called the African diaspora, that is the dispersion. Like they have something called like the Jewish diaspora after what the Romans did. So likewise, there's an African diaspora. So in the diaspora in Brazil, there's a large Afro-Brazilian population. And sadly, like many people in diaspora, they live in poverty, they live in favelas, right? So the favelas in Brazil are places, they're entire communities, but they're at the lower economic end of things. And Brazil is divided along lines of, it has its own ethno and racial difficulties, just like the United States, but different, of course. Now, as far as the depth of the politics, I don't know. As I mentioned, that in Brazil, when they had slavery rebellions in Brazil, they lasted for weeks, in some cases years. But I'll tell you this much: Brazil was the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to get rid of slavery. Brazil actually got rid of slavery in 1880. Now, let me put this in context for you. What that meant was Brazil did not get rid of slavery until 20 years before the start of the 20th century. You know, that thing we left just about 30 years ago, or 20 years ago. That's how close we are still to that legacy. So slavery was very beneficial to Brazil. It helped to stratify society along racial lines and political lines. And of course, the people who were the Creoles, there will be people from European descendants who mixed with indigenous people, became the Creoles, and eventually that involves Africans as well. So it's a very fluid situation, but there's a large Black population down there. And as far as I know, the politics, it didn't end until 1880, so it definitely has something to do with the value of Black people and the stratification of the system. There's two.
David?
King Leopold's Congo Free State,
Yes.
in my memory, began before the Berlin Conference. I may be wrong there, but what impact did his atrocities in the Congo impact on the Berlin Conference?
Very good question. So as I mentioned, there's a whole lot of things that were happening before the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885. So if you assert that King Leopold's Congo Free State was existing or at least being formed before the Berlin Conference, that's correct. Like a lot of Europeans were claiming territory in Africa before 1884, which is of course why Otto von Bismarck called the conference, to try and bring some type of system, if you want to call it that, to how Europeans could claim legitimately various parts of Africa. But the thing about the Congo Free State was this: he had Belgium, a small European country, and King Leopold was determined to not be left out of the imperial land grab. So during the Berlin Conference, what they did, they essentially came up with this agreement. They said, look, Leopold, you're a small European country, you don't have a big army, you don't have a big navy, you're kind of landlocked. Here's what we'll do for you though. We'll give you access to the largest, one of the largest, it's still to this day, one of the most mineral rich areas on Earth. I don't know how many folk know that the uranium for the original 2 atomic bombs was gotten from the Congo. So that U-235, the ones that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, came from the Congo. So here's Leopold, he gets control of the Congo with this proviso, this stipulation. All we ask in return is that when we, the British and the French and the Germans, want to get oil and rubber or whatever else we want out of the Congo, you let us go in there and get what we want, and you can have the rest. You can run it, you can do whatever you want in there. The Congo has copper. It's got gold, it's got diamonds, it's got uranium clearly. It's got a whole bunch of stuff that modernizing European states need, and Leopold can have all that stuff. All he's gotta do is just let people come in and take what they want. He can have a police force, he can run it any way he wants, and he does. What he does, essentially, is establish a form of modern slavery in the Congo. So people who, for example, are, who go to tap rubber trees, you screw into you take a cork and you shoot it into the rubber tree, you hang a bucket on it, and then leave the bucket in there, and the sap from the tree just runs out just into the bucket. If, for example, you're a rubber collector and you don't get your quota for the day or whatever interval you're supposed to be, they count them, you might get your hand cut off. So people are appalled at some practices Africans conduct today, like cutting off hands like Foday Sankoh did in Sierra Leone. But that's what Leopold does in the Congo. And to show you how even more diabolically shrewd he was, he took minority groups in the Congo and said, listen, I know that Group A and Group B have been traditionally fighting each other. Group B has traditionally been weaker. So what we'll do is I'll take Group B and arm them with modern weapons. Guess what now? The formerly oppressed becomes the aggressors in Group A. It initiates a process where people who generally had difficulty with each other anyway begin fighting each other on a regular basis. They're fighting down to this very day. It's very similar to what happened in Rwanda between the Tutsis and the Hutus. They had difficulties, and the Belgians were the ones who ended up preferring the Tutsis because they were taller. They had, here's the phrase they used, they had less African features, whatever that is. Okay, they had more, well, I have no hair. They had smoother hair. They had, their noses weren't broad, more aquiline like European noses. So the Europeans favored them, brown skin notwithstanding. Well, they could do a bunch of things. But the thing is though, that those ethnic differences exacerbated differences between the two people. And we remember the 1994 genocide. That wasn't the first time, because the Hutus and the Tutsis were added in 1956 as well. And by the way, the one thing you don't hear about, we hear about Rwanda for a good reason, we should. But there have been similar difficulties in the neighboring country of Burundi. So these forces that Leopold set in motion have been replicated and continue to be with us in destabilizing things in Central Africa down to this very day. Yes,
I have a question for you.
did you have a question?
I think yours was answered by him or not?
I just wanted to comment. You had a book to read, the first one, nonfiction books, and it was about Leopold Gold.
Okay.
And it was.
King Leopold's Gold? Oh, King Leopold's Ghost. Okay. There's another one, I think, in the Heart of Darkness, something in the Heart of Darkness too, I think, about the Congo. Yeah. Joseph Conrad.
Mhm.
He, listen, you know, Leopold was in addition to having, I think, an infatuation with a young teenage girl, was just a creep. Kid? Question?
Does that take care of your question? Can you give us your thoughts, Dr. Johnson, about how Wilberforce was able to amass support for his desire to eradicate slavery and brought in abolition to England, please?
You know, I'm not as knowledgeable on William Wilberforce as I need to be. I know that he certainly was a leader, again, with Thomas Clarkson and Grenville Sharp in the abolition movement. But I think the thing that stands out to me the most about William Wilberforce and that whole slavery, England abolishing slavery, is that it occurred at a time when England was growing less reliant upon it anyway. So while they definitely deserve credit for doing a great humanitarian, if you want to put it in these terms, moral thing, it wasn't like the British government suddenly, you know, woke up one morning and go, oh my God, we've been doing this horrible thing. It was less reliant upon it anyway. So they didn't need that. They abolished it when it became most convenient for them, because they could have done it at any time. Okay. So William Wilberforce, and he ended up getting very, very, I do know enough of his life story to know that he got very, very ill and ended up nearly dying as a result of trying to abolish the slave trade, because it was a deeply held belief in England that this was it. Look, this transatlantic slave trade made people millionaires. It made them wealthy. It made African kings wealthy. It made people on the American side of the Atlantic wealthy. And, you know, say what you want to about human nature, but when people find something that's going to make them wealthy, if no one's going to sit up there and protest about it, and it's within the value structure of the day, they kept doing it. So I've always been kind of suspicious about the fact, while I give William Wilberforce credit, as far as the British government goes, I never failed to notice that they abolished slavery right around the time when that system was becoming less valuable to them anyway.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Are there any questions on the chat?
Not from the chat?
Anything on chat?
There are no questions in the chat.
No questions on the chat. We have one more session coming up, unless you have something else to add. We have one more session coming up next Wednesday, and you already told
I
us.
will share with you all next week about why we have established something called Africa Command in the wake of 9/11. And then once we found out the extent of Al-Qaeda, and then there was Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You know, for a movement, Al-Qaeda shifted from Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden was, and it moved to Iraq. Especially after we invaded Iraq in 2003. I can't remember the guy who was in charge of Iraq, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but once we did that, and then it took on the form of ISIS that metastasized and became ISIS, we finally established something called Africa Command in Stuttgart, Germany. Now, for my money, if you're going to have Africa Command, it should be literally on the continent, but I get it. So we're going to talk about what Africa Command has been doing in the global war on terror, what it's been doing to help fight ISIS, but also I want to take a look at something called ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. And there's another organization, but particularly ECOWAS and its role in preserving as much as they can stability in West Africa, and also how they have been part of the problem as well as much of the solution in many cases. And briefly touch upon the civil war that occurred in Sierra Leone and the Liberian Civil War that began in the 1990s, because those two states right there, the Liberian Civil War destabilized an entire region. And what does that mean for America? And here's the last point. finally, when you have a narco state like Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Bissau, a few years ago, was identified as being the world's first narco terrorist. In other words, it's run by drug dealers. And drug dealers in South America figured out that, first of all, that to fly from South America to Guinea-Bissau is actually a pretty short distance. And then they take their drugs, move from Guinea-Bissau north through Southern Europe, back across the Atlantic into Canada, then down into America. So this is a clear and present danger. And we don't pay enough attention to that. And we don't pay enough attention to it because it is the African continent. We'll talk more about that. And in that way, in that fashion, by mentioning all that stuff, I'll brighten your day next week. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.